Welcome to Hacking Exposed. We have a pretty interesting and intriguing discussion today, but we're also going to spin this into a bit of a year in review of 2013 and a look forward of 2014. So I'm excited to have Brian Wallace join us. Say hello, Brian.
Hi, everyone.
So Brian joined us last year at Cylance and is just a remarkable talent, especially with regard to emerging markets, but also international botnet activity, takedowns, things of that nature. So I'm going to allow Brian to walk through most of what he's been finding out there in the international botnet space and talk about some things that you can do to help mitigate the impact that botnets and attacking teams and nation-state groups and others are going to leverage against you as you go forward in your defenses. So with that, let's just roll right along. So if you've not been to one of these, I'll just quickly and briefly discuss the structure. So we try and do it every month or so, which usually goes to every couple of months. And we provide as much demos as humanly possible. I've always been a big believer in that. It just seems to be, kinetic learning seems to be the best way for everybody universally to let it absorb in. And we try and do it as live as possible. And I think Brian's demos are live today, so this should be exciting.
Yep.
And then we will have a Q&A at the end, but please do ask questions throughout. There is a questions tab in your little app that you're involved with, engaged there on the right-hand side. Just feel free to start your questions anytime you have them. I or Brian will not be able to answer them right away, but we will certainly get through them at the end. And we love ideas for topics, and so please send those in, either in the questions or you can send us emails directly. We often have guest presenters both inside and outside, and we've done that in the past. And then this will be recorded and available. Usually turnaround time is about 2 days is what we've been averaging, but check back in a couple, 3 days, and you should be able to get to it. So let's look back a bit. So 2013 was, it's always, every year seems to be just more interesting than the last. Every time you think that things are getting boring in our industry of security, they tend to just get more and more interesting. And I rarely, if ever, get bored. It's probably one of the reasons why I keep loving to drive and help drive this industry and try and make it better, is there's so much opportunity for improvement, and there's so much to talk about. So we're going to talk a little bit about 2013, and then at the end we're going to talk about 2014, some of the things that we are predicting. So I always think about the security industry from a threat perspective. Okay, there are other perspectives to look at it. There is there are risk perspectives, there are compliance perspectives, there are audit perspectives, all those kind of things. But I really always go back to the threat perspective of how do these guys get in, how do they stick around, and how do you defend against them based on that knowledge of their tools and tactics and procedures, etc. So I usually go back to the attacks that have been known and some of them unknown. But I think, if we were to rank them all, I think we would have this list, 1 to 10. So number 1, I think probably the insider threats and the PRISM discussion, all the talk around the NSA and spying and things of that nature, probably would have to be the clear leader in terms of who's talking about what and why is it important. I don't think anything was a shock, and certainly not from my perspective and a lot of security professionals. There was no shock in what the NSA was admitting to and what Snowden was trying to release. I think what was more shocking is that so many people were shocked, and I think that is the real story with that particular incident and the ones that followed. Now, APT1, we all knew about this, of course. Everybody that were serious researchers in the business knew about the APT1 team, and as well as other teams out of China and others, and APAC and others. The report came out, which I thought was a pretty good report in terms of just at least getting the data out to everybody so that they can keep an eye out for it and help defend their systems. New York Times, Wall Street Journal hits. I thought those were really interesting, going after the very people that create the news. And then, of course, those that are meant to help protect your systems and help you use your systems, guys like Adobe and Bit9 breaches with them hacking into their build servers and running off with their private signing certs. I think that's really interesting because obviously we started to see a lot of malware that was signed by Bit9 and signed by Adobe. And then I don't know if you've just recently seen, but Target just announced 40 million credit cards that have been exposed during a period of time, about the last 2 weeks, 3 weeks. And it looks like the breach occurred at the point of sale systems. So it's, at least at first glance, first look, and I have no insider information, just speculation, but it looks like something was probably set up on the POS systems in all of the stores, because that's where it went. It wasn't online through Target.com. Looks like it was through the point of sale systems, and they were able to basically extract the magstripe data information, which would include, of course, all of the critical data like credit card information, expiration, secret codes, security codes, stuff like that. So I think there's going to be a lot more to come from that particular breach, and so it made it instantly to the top 5. But then you have Facebook and Twitter and Gmail and LinkedIn password leaks. I mean, it's just, you name the big company, and there was some public announcement of at least a password leakage. The U.S. Federal Reserve being a target, even though it was a small hack in terms of technical hack, in terms of what they were able to gain, I do have a little bit of insight there. But the fact that they were going after the U.S. Federal Reserve, to me, is the most interesting fact, that they're starting to understand the world economy as it stands, and they are surgically going after that which is allows us to be most vulnerable in the world. I think that's interesting. Also going after guys like Living Social. Apple malware, there was a bunch this year. I love to even flashback further to 2012 with the flashback worm that went on to about 600,000 Macs. And when is iPad next, right? When is iPhone next? iOS. I think when it comes to just the most curious is guys like security vendors. We are flawed too. So part of an ad server or an ad widget was an ad server was infected with malware, and FireEye was serving that up. It was either in their management console or in their emails. Can't recall that, but I think that's just an interesting point, because in terms of a vector, anybody can be taken advantage of and victimized in that way. And then lastly, and this has been coming up quite a bit, we at Cylance broke a whole bunch of ransomware late last year, by reverse engineering the passwords being used to encrypt, and it was very, very successful. But of course, what that means is whenever you figure out how the weakness of the bad guy, they turn around and make it that much stronger, and that's what they did with CryptoLocker. So the ability to reverse engineer is much more difficult, and the ability to really help people with those victims of CryptoLocker are a lot tougher. And I think we'll see more of that in 2012 as well. So let's get on to the topic at hand. So Brian spends all of his time really understanding the threat in the marketplace, especially around botnets, and what we can do to affect the impact of those botnets onto our infrastructure and our systems out there in the world. And we help customers do that through a series of steps that we call Art of Deterrence. So I'm going to allow Brian to just pick up and head off onto your talk and demo here, Brian.
Okay. So as Stu was saying, this talk is primarily about emerging markets, but with a focus on Indonesia specifically. An emerging market is a nation with rapidly growing business. There are many groups of these throughout the world, such as BRICS and NICT. Often, the rapid growth is a result of heavy investment from either an economic group or from a nation state. The rapid growth brings new challenges to the country. Primarily, the laws have enough trouble keeping up with a steady growing economy, but when a rapidly growing economy comes around, the laws can't keep up with the changing threats that are facing their nation and also are emerging from their nation. Have you seen this? It's actually an image of Indonesia, and here is the map view of Indonesia. Indonesia is the largest economy in Southeast Asia. It had an economic crisis starting in the late 90s. After they introduced a new investment plan in 2011, it began to grow again. It realized 32.5 billion in investments in 2012. Just this year, Akamai stated that the observed attack traffic originating from Indonesia nearly doubled quarter over quarter this year. It overtook China for the largest volume of attack traffic this year, and 90% of attacks are over HTTP and HTTPS. So let's rewind a bit. A little over 2 years ago, I was primarily developing, studying software engineering, and I returned to security research. After I came back to security research, I was introduced to Tom at TikTok Computers. Tom does a lot of web design work for clients. A large number of his clients are WordPress users, and they were under heavy attack. The primary method of attack was remote file inclusion, which used payloads which were encoded PHP. And a large number of the payloads were IRC bots. The way these attackers identify their targets, they were looking mostly for WordPress cPanel and other content management systems. They weren't all WordPress servers, but they were focused on WordPress, but not on WordPress as a whole, but instead on particular themes. If you're not familiar with the WordPress theme system, themes are created by third parties and then released, and they can be installed to your WordPress blog by the administrator. So these developers were sharing code for doing features like uploading files and getting thumbnails for remote images. In this case, the TimThumb and Uploadify code, there were vulnerable versions which were being included into a large number of themes and plugins. Now, to find the vulnerable WordPress servers, they were using what's referred to as dorks. Dorks are search strings used to find vulnerable software via some sort of search engine. They're more commonly referred to as Google dorks, as Google is the primary search engine used for them, but the attackers can use a wide range of search engines, including Google, Yandex, Baidu, etc. Now, to use these Google dorks without being blocked by their search engines, they have to use multiple IP addresses. In this case, they used scanners, which were bots installed on infected systems, although sometimes they just scan from their local systems in Indonesia. Scanners search with the search engines, and in order to verify that a target was vulnerable, they would actually use a test attack instead of doing something like just checking the name or something like that. There's a bit of speculation around whether or not they release their own vulnerable themes to increase their revenue as well as their victim base. Here are the reasons why. Most vulnerable themes aren't free, and by selling them, they could increase their revenue. And also, themes that aren't free are harder to identify as vulnerable because you don't have free and open access to the source code, so you essentially find out that they're vulnerable when you see them starting to be exploited. With TimThumb, the vulnerability is a remote file inclusion. The payloads must seem like images to the TimThumb code. It doesn't require a whole lot of changes to be done by the attackers. They just need, for instance, a GIF header, which is a few bytes just at the beginning of the file, which doesn't get in the way of PHP executing. The exploit changes slightly over different versions. particularly with where the payloads actually need to be hosted. For example, certain versions of TimThumb require that the domain be in a whitelist, but the way they checked against this whitelist was incorrect. So they often would use domains like this to infect, like flickr.com whatever domain they got control of. And this would allow them to bypass the whitelist. Uploadify had an arbitrary file upload. It allowed for unauthenticated uploads of any files, which the attackers used files with the PHP extension, so it could be executed as PHP code. They often used the same payloads that were used in TimThumb, but the image header was not required. A lot of their they had a wide range of different payloads. A lot of their payloads were backdoors. Some were very simple PHP backdoors, like bopcrew. They also used stun shell as well, which is a bit more advanced, but I'll go into a bit more later. Most of the code was copy and pasted. They copy and pasted shells from publicly available shells, and it seemed very rarely was it original code. The comments in the code itself, though, attributed to the attackers a large number of times. There was Indonesian comments. There was even listing of email addresses, and then IRC servers and channels and shoutouts. It was they weren't afraid of showing who they were. The backdoors also had very little authentication. Some of the payloads were specifically for infection notification. The purpose is just to verify that the target is vulnerable. Some just print a string generated by PHP code, and then upon execution, whatever is checking to see if the server is vulnerable could then read that string and verify it was vulnerable. Some attempted to send an email. In the case where the servers were being used primarily for spam, they would check and see if they could send an email via the local SMTP server to a public address. And some were droppers, some just downloaded and executed other payloads. And of course, some were bots that called home. This is separate from some of the more featureful bots that would actually do things. In some cases, there were bots that just merely connected to an IRC server and indicated that there was an infection. As for the bots, the most common is pbot. Rainx and Putri and a few others were used. The bots were primarily PHP and sometimes Perl. All used IRC with unencrypted connections. The passwords were stored in plain text, and they used poor methods of authentication. As I mentioned before, payloads were encoded. PHP allows for dynamic execution of PHP code with the eval function, so you can pass in a string which just contains PHP code and it'll execute it. There are other ways to do this, but this is the most straightforward way. Payloads are encoded with a group of functions like gzdeflate and base64 encode. It acts as a layer of obfuscation, but it's effective against a large number of researchers who don't want to put forth the time to actually decode these payloads. I'm going to show you an example here being decoded. Oops. Okay, so here we have a payload which was actually uploaded to one of our honeypots. So we can take the URL to the payload and go over to the PHP decoder and say decode by URL. And we can see here that the source code here has changed because the decoder has gone through and automatically decoded this string. And we can see that there are well over 20 layers of encoding here. Okay. Now to go into specific bots themselves. PBot is an IRC PHP bot. It's easy to identify from its configuration block. The authentication is based on a password, but it can also be based on the virtual host set by the IRC server, which means that the bot is partially relying on the IRC server as part of its security. A vulnerability was discovered twice independently by myself and another in PBot, and my exploit of that used an undocumented command. The bot has denial of service functionality. It's a remote access Trojan. It can spam, it can port scan, and it can also drop and execute other payloads. Rainx is another IRC PHP bot. Its authentication is based on username. Its pub call functionality makes authentication channel-based. So if a user had access to the channel that Rainx connects into, one would be able to run commands on the Rainx bot. So that is, again, relying on the IRC server for security in the bot. It actually uses a feature of PHP called variable variables. It's almost a scripting equivalent of a pointer. Rainx has the capability of denial of service, remote access Trojan, a port scanner. It's a dork scanner, exploitation. It can spread, it can update, and it's a dropper. And it's fairly surprising that Rainx showed up less than PBot when it's as flexible as it is. Putri is an IRC Perl bot. Authentication based on username, which again is relying on the IRC server. Some versions will only flood IRC. As I was mentioning before, some bots, they didn't really have an external purpose as much as they were just identifying vulnerable servers. Putri, in this case, was identifying vulnerable servers. Commands are parsed with regular expressions, which in a few cases can be exploited. It acts as a remote access Trojan and the denial of service tool. Harazuku is an IRC PHP bot. The authentication is user and password based. The authentication does not rely as much on the IRC server for security, which is probably because it can jump from IRC server to IRC server. Harazuku can orchestrate denial of service attacks and activate other bots by accessing their URL. As I was mentioning, a few exploits have been released for these. The PBot exploits were released last year, including a Metasploit module being written. For Rainx, Bop Crew, and Stunshell, the exploits were released earlier this year by myself. The Putri exploit was released in November by myself, and I hope to show you the Harazuku exploit right now. Okay, so we're going to jump into the demo now. I'm just going to launch an IRC server, and I'm adding the demo bots to them. Okay, so let's jump in the server. And I'm just going to join all the channels the bots are joining. Okay, so we'll start by looking at PBot. Have the source code open too. Okay. So what I'm going to be using to attack these bots is the Botnet attack modular framework. It's a tool I've been working on slowly in my spare time to attack botnets in just different ways. The tool is far from being released though. As I was mentioning before with PBot, the configuration block is extremely identifiable. This is the configuration block I'm talking about. This is in every PBot, and it's quite easy to spot, even with regular expressions. So detecting PBOTs is fairly easy. So as you see, we're in the PBOT channel. The only administrators are the PBOTs, and then it's just me in the channel with the PBOTs. So we can just we can use BAMF to dump out the configuration from the bot. So we just pass in the command to dump and then the path to the source code. And as you can see, we can dump out the configuration block. Now, what the exploit to drop PBOT does is it authenticates as the bot, exploiting the fact that the host auth variable is set to asterisk, and that allows anyone or any virtual host to execute commands. So it's a bypass of its own authentication. And you can get all the authentication details straight from the PBOT source code. So if you just point the BAMF script to a PBOT, we can then just drop it like that. So what we ended up doing is logging in as user. Since it's only a password authentication, we were able to log in and then use the die command to cause all the bots to shut themselves down. Next, we'll look at RAINX. As I was mentioning, RAINX is a bit more involved. It doesn't really have a configuration block that is easy to identify. It can generally be identified by either the string RAINX somewhere being in there, or if we look towards the bottom here, these add-ons seem to be fairly reliable as a means of detection, looking for this line of code here, the B array function. Now, the exploit for RAINX is attacking the pub call functionality I was mentioning before. The fault in the code is they actually don't check to see if the private message itself is coming from the channel that they're expecting the pub commands to come from. So we join this. We're in the IRC channel for this bot. So by pressing enter, we start the attack. Now what this attack does is it's private messaging each one of the possible bot names, which is a very large number. All the bot names are predefined inside the script, so BAMF will go through, parse out all the names, and then it'll private message each one, acting as if it was doing a pub call, but instead of doing it from a channel, it's doing it in a private message. This way, just knowing the list of names that the RAINX bot will use, we can then run commands on it. This can take a bit of time, but as you can see, the users are slowly dropping out of the IRC channel. Okay, I'm going to move on to Harajuku. The exploit against Harajuku is not as effective as the PBOT or the RAINX, but it is effective in the art of deterrence sense. We can use this exploit to frustrate our attackers and put them into a state where we can then frustrate them from attacking us. It's not essentially an attack against the botnet itself, but more against the operators. So there is some code in Harajuku where, when it receives a notice that looks like a CTCP message that starts with KB, it will then take in those parameters to kick and then ban that specific user from a set channel. This is basically the only command that somehow missed authentication, so I exploited it. So let's go and do Deterrence. Now, what this attack will do is it'll use the bot that has an operator privilege in the channel to then ban everyone who's not a bot. This will stop the botnet operators from being able to control their bots because they won't be able to access the channel. In the case where the botnet operators are actually admins on the IRC servers, this will just be frustrating. In other cases, it will mean they can't access their botnet. So this is a quick one. Yeah. As you can see, the exploit kicked me from the channel, and as you can see here, it kicked the other bots from the channel. And then ultimately what it does is it'll ban anyone from joining except for operators. Okay.
I love this. I love this stuff, Brian. This is, you know, it's kind of pent-up aggression, to be honest with you, right? Because being on the defense side and trying to help so many folks try and defend against the attackers and all the various forms and vectors of attack and techniques and everything else, it's kind of nice to share a little bit of the pain.
Yeah, this all came from the fact that we couldn't get local law enforcement in Indonesia to cooperate with us to even look into these attackers. So we had to go through non-conventional means to stop these attacks from attacking Tom's customers. And we used art of deterrence tactics to do this. Do you want to describe a bit of art of deterrence, or should I?
Yeah, well, this is an effort that Brian and I have been putting together to kind of combine both the physical and cyber world of deterrence. As you know, throughout history and throughout all wars or any conflict, there has been traditionally just a physical side of both active, you know, weaponry and fighting versus deterrence and defense. And we've seen a lot of the techniques used in the physical world be 100% translatable into the cyber world. And so we've cataloged and categorized and built a methodology around that Brian and I are building content around to help you, just in the same way that I created Hacking Exposed back in the day, creating the techniques and the recipe-driven approach to help you, empower you, and give you the sense of you know, somewhat limited control, albeit some control, around how to impact and affect the attacker's success in going after you. So look for that book. We were shooting for December this month, but it will be pushed a couple of months. We're hoping to have a little bit more out probably by RSA timeframe, the end of February. But just keep an eye out on our website at Cylance, as well as the Twitter feed for the latest and greatest on that. But yeah, we really, at the end of the day, want to deter the attacker. We don't, you know, we're not breaking any laws. We're not going after a system that is owned by a non-attacker and affecting that system. We're simply going after the true, you know, butt in the seat at the keyboard, frustrating them, confusing them, you know, performing a lot of disruption in their efforts, and they tend to be pretty successful. So we are providing both conventional and non-conventional means. So I think it would be a really interesting read for everybody. And our dear friend, retired Admiral Bill Fallon, is also helping develop the physical equivalent side of that story. That, you know, he ran the head of Central Command for the Iraq Wars, and he has a lot to add around the physical side of it all and how it translates into cyber. So I think it's going to be a really exciting book.
In Art of Deterrence, we split up the recipe-driven attacks essentially into 3 different categories: understanding your attackers, deterring them from attacking, and then vengeance, to make sure, you know, they don't come around knocking again. And as we mentioned, the focus is on situations where conventional means may not be effective.
Yeah, DDoS tends to be one of those.
Yeah. So going into one of the recipes, we gathered information. So a attack scanner was released to gather information from WordPress blogs that were under attack. We were able to gather information on the attacks themselves with attack scanner, as well as create what's known as shallow honeypots, which are honeypots you never actually infect. It's just kind of a very informative firewall. We also protect the users in the meantime, so we avoided our customers from being compromised. We obtained a wealth of attack information, and we also obtained a large number of RFI payloads. Now, the RFI payloads were optionally auto-submitted to the decoder I was showing you earlier. It automates the decoding process, so it allows for a quicker analysis by eye. The payloads are persistently stored in an online archive for public reference, so the payloads could be referenced in exploits as well as read by researchers and potential attackers for the botnet itself. The researchers could also see the original locations. So in general, the locations where payloads were stored were compromised servers. So those could be identified and mitigated them. Recently, the decoder includes an experimental JavaScript interface as well as an RSS feed for newly found pbots and rainx bots. The RSS feed allows you to easily parse out the configuration blocks for pbot and rainx. Now this is a Maltego graph of the bots from about 6 months ago. The green circles here are the command and control servers. Each one of the blue dots is a payload. Now it doesn't map to a specific bot. That generally maps to more than one live bot. So this graph doesn't actually show the number of bots that were in each server. So that would be an even larger graph. And on the right here, the orange dots represent the different bots themselves. On the left is pbot, and on the right is rainx. So as we can see, the pbot was much more prevalent. So another art of deterrence recipe is exposure. So we exposed the vulnerability independently discovered by myself and another, and made sure that this exploit was easy to use and easy to understand by the public. In doing this, we released a Metasploit module, which made it very easy for anyone to go out and attack a rainx or a pbot botnet. And a rainx vulnerability was later discovered, as I mentioned earlier this year, and it was released as a Metasploit module as well, along with other Metasploit modules, about 4 at one time, which can often bring a lot of attention to an exploit. So essentially what we did was we put a means to attack these botnets into the hands of researchers and other botters or anyone who had the desire to go out and ruin their day. So after doing that, this is what the botnets look like now. In this graph, the command and control servers are the blue dots, which is now down to less than 10 there. And as you can see, the payloads have decreased significantly. Yeah, they basically got demolished by this tactic. Here's a graph showing over the past year how effective this method was. As we can see at the beginning of the year, from January to February, the number of remote file inclusion attacks we saw against attack scanner customers was fairly steady. In March, the 4 exploits were released. The rainx, the VopCrew, and the 2 stun shell exploits were released to Metasploit, which led to an immediate decrease and then a increase in remote file inclusion attacks we saw. Now, what's interesting about this graph is it's not the the number of successful attacks, but instead it's actually the number of blocked attacks we had. So we were able to block much more attacks in May. Now, this data point for a long time confused me, but then I realized that this data point is panic. In March to April, there was a lot of people attacking their networks because they suddenly had an exploit that they wanted to play with, or they now knew of a large number of bots they could take down or take over. So they caused hell for these botters. So in May, to deal with the loss of many botnets, they had to increase the number of attacks they were doing. They had to put more out there. They had to work harder. And in doing so, they ended up sending us more payloads, more information that we could post, which would then be used by people now watching the decoder and attack them further. And as you can see, the tactic worked quite well. So these attackers, they didn't just disappear. In a usual situation, by conventional means, they would likely be imprisoned or on the down low. But in this case, they are moving on to another CMS called Joomla. They're using bots far less, and their attacks are much simpler. They're very quick, arbitrary file uploads. They're not using other compromised servers to compromise other servers, and the whole process is far less organized. So effectively, this organization has been put on its side by Art of Deterrence tactics.
All right. Well, thanks again, Brian, man. Awesome stuff. I love this stuff. And I think one of the ways that we work from there is to maybe think about what's ahead of us, right? What's going on in the coming months and the next year. We often like to do our predictions, even though they may either be too early or they may just be flat out wrong. I think it's good discussion to walk through a little bit about where we're seeing the new threats, the new attacks, and how we think that's going to translate into how we need to defend our systems differently. So just a few to talk about and think about. We've seen a ton of Bitcoin attention in terms of going after the whole Bitcoin system, but also in terms of stealing Bitcoins, mining Bitcoins, etc. Do you want to talk a little bit about this one, Brian?
Oh, yeah, sure. So as Stu was saying, this year we have seen a ton of Bitcoin-related cybercrime. Not only just infections on endpoints mining Bitcoins, but also massive heists online. And this isn't going to go anywhere. Bitcoin is still valued at well over the USD. So a single Bitcoin is worth quite a bit of effort to an attacker. The increase is likely to end up on targets such as gamer PCs, where there's high CPU and high GPU. So the attackers can use the resources to mine these Bitcoins. And also on gamer endpoints, they tend to steer away from AV, and they often aren't averse to piracy, so they can easily be affected by a malicious torrent or something like that.
Yeah, so I think the other part of what we need to think about it too is more infrastructure-focused attacks. We have seen them trickle in from time to time over the past 4 to 5 years. Stuxnet certainly made it headline news, and we've been seeing it quite a bit in oil and gas and into even building management systems, industrial control systems, and it's just going to increase. And I think as the footprint and surface area goes small, so will the attackers, and that's exactly what's happening. They're looking for any opportunity in and how to stay in and how to go low and slow outside the radar of your typical defense and diagnostic visibility. So we're going to start to see more of that. They're going to be firmware level attacks. There's going to be more embedded system attacks, and I think that's going to be a big part of the landscape for 2014 and really beyond. We'll see more Apple stuff. Again, we've been predicting the whole iOS attack, which I do believe will come. It's just an issue of when. I mean, we prove it every single year with demonstrating how easy it is to hack into an iPad or an iPhone and exploit a vulnerability in some applet somewhere to break out a sandbox and to take over control of the system. And so the bad guys know all this stuff, and there's plenty of 0 days being sold on the black market around it. So the likelihood of a big attack coming is certainly high. Ransomware is going to get even uglier. We've seen it. It's just too bloody successful. These guys are making a ton of money. People just pay the amounts. Although the highest price I have seen, and Brian showed this to me, I hadn't heard of it, was 30 million. Basically ransoming all their data for $30 million, and they have to deliver it in 100 days. And I don't know.
That figure was the crypto locker guys. They made 300 million in 100 days.
300 or 30?
Oh, 30 million. Sorry.
30 million. Okay, sorry. Yeah, so 30 million is what they made. Apologies, in 100 days, and that's just mind-boggling. I mean, why wouldn't you do that? I mean, how discouraging is it for a good guy? Like how easy is it to make that kind of money as a bad guy? It's just pretty discouraging. So I think there's too much incentive there. It's too easy to occur. And it's also one of the reasons why we started this company, to be quite honest with you. And one of our first customers was hit with ransomware, to be frank, and it was, of course, through a hacked up RDP session and get onto the infrastructure and run the ransomware encryption, and then they basically held them at gunpoint. Luckily, we were able to reverse engineer that and get them out for free, but that's not always the case, and it always occurs because something executes at the endpoint that is malicious. And that's what Cylance is all about and why we're so passionate about protection at the endpoint, because our technology can avoid 99+% of all of this stuff, known and unknown, with no signature. So this is what drives us every day. Android, we're going to see more and more Android, as I mean, we've seen a lot of it. In fact, there's there's tens of thousands of samples now of Android malware, and it's only going to grow. More of the usual nation-state and cybercrime. And the big question that we have is, will there be big retaliation around the government-sponsored stuff within the U.S., NSA in particular? The Anon guys have gone quiet in part because they've been busted and thrown in jail, but in large part because they've gone underground and kind of stayed cool. That usually translates into a couple of years of something bad coming back out of them. So we'll see if it comes up this year, since this past year, 2013, was pretty quiet with the hacktivist teams. So at any rate, if you have other predictions, I'd love to hear about them. Certainly submit those either as questions or otherwise, but hopefully you'll have a great happy holidays this year, wherever that might be, in whatever country you might have it in. And thank you very much for attending. So what we're going to do now, this is where we'll switch over to Q&A, and I'll walk through a few of the questions. If you've got time, hang tight. We'll try and get to yours. And Brian, if you do have questions right now, please click on the questions tab, write your questions, and we'll answer it. So the first one, Brian, for you, I thought was interesting is, so you mentioned traffic from Indonesia. We do know if that, do we know if that traffic is coming from Indonesian VPNs, or if they are, fully owned, infrastructure?
Well, I don't have a distinguishing feature between the VPNs and traffic directly coming from Indonesians in Indonesia. What's likely happening is that a large number of local servers are being compromised as the attackers, from their recent boost in economy, became much more tech-based. So there's a lot of naive tech users now. So business owners and groups like that will have a large number of computers which can be accessible on the internet, and any Indonesian hackers could then do local hacks and then build up the number of servers they can use.
Okay, so let me jump down to the next one here. So Aaron was looking for the BAMF stuff, but it's not out yet, right? So
right. I haven't. I'll
yeah.
push the source code I have here today up to GitHub later. Right now, the BAMF repository is just a collection of ad hoc scripts. So I'll push this up, and you can look for the most recent change to see where these specific scripts are.
Okay, and then you had a follow-up on that one, which was, is there any chance that BAMF will support takedown of the Caton-based IRC?
I'll have to add it, but the functionality of BAMF is strongly focused around a modular design. So it would be kind of like a Metasploit, but specifically for botnets. So if a feature or if a target botnet isn't implemented, it can either be requested or very easily implemented by someone else.
Exactly, and that's kind of the whole idea, right? Is that to help extend the supportability and the community effort around some of this stuff.
Right.
Because we all know it's not like you got a lot of free time sitting around.
Sure.
Okay, let's see. Attack scanner was released. This assumes thought awareness by the customer one way or another that there is an attack already. I'm not quite sure what that one. Do you know what that means?
Yeah, I think they're trying to establish the idea that people who went out and got attack scanner already knew they were under attack, which is true. As far as attack scanner went, it was primarily to protect the clients of Tom at TikTok Computers. That way his clients could use it as he suggested it to them, but we also opened it to a large number of other people. So we were able to protect these specific clients in this case. It wasn't a 100% anti-bot solution. It was a targeted approach using art of deterrence tactics to deter these attackers from attacking the targets.
Got it. Got it. Okay. And I think, let's see, we've got one general one, which is, and this is, poor Ivan, I feel your pain, but he says, didn't we already lose the game against the bad guys? Aren't they, already always a step in front of us? Sometimes I have the feeling that enterprise customers don't realize that they have, in fact, a problem. The answer is mostly we have a defined budget and no money for additional security software. I mean, the whole point of Hacking Exposed and the whole point of what we try to do here is to not allow you to give up the fight. There are tons of techniques, tons of tools, tons of behaviors that you can get yourself as administrators and your users to employ that will prevent the vast majority of these things from ever occurring. And it does take a lot of education, a rinse and repeat, and it also takes some tools, some technology, and we hopefully are giving you a little bit more confidence and a little bit more support around what you can do to defend yourself and protect your systems, even beyond products, to be quite honest. I mean, certainly there's some decent products out there, but for the most part, you're right. They're garbage. They don't really work. No, they manage the symptom of the problem, and there's always another way around that symptom if it's being blocked. So, we're taking that tactic as we build our technology. We're making sure that we're going at the core of the problem, at the heart of the problem. We don't care where it's coming in from, and that's another important point to reiterate that you need to think about solutions to all these security problems by going after the core of that problem. And that's an important distinction. All right, so let's see. Will this webinar be made available for offline? Yes, it was. It'll be made available in about 2 to 3 days, and you can download it when you log back in to the site. We do have a question from Paul. Hey, Paul. Around what are the implications of retaliation? And I'll share my 2 cents on the thought, but I also want to, Brian, speak up for whatever you feel appropriate. But, certainly there are always legal implications of retaliation. And, I always repeat that at the very typically at the very beginning when we start to go down this path. However, there are many things that you can do that don't relate to legal and that don't require, triplicate signing of the owner of the asset, etc. You should be made aware of the local laws. You should be made aware of the local authorities, and you should make contact with them, as we often do, if not always do. But in the cases where, especially in emerging markets, we have found that they simply do not have bandwidth whatsoever, and they have very few, if any, laws. And often these systems are, for the systems that are owned and private VPN'd by the bad guys, then those are bad guy assets, right? And making that distinction is an important part of that identification process. But for those that are not owned by the botnet operators and that are obviously stolen, hacked up, in those cases, yes, you do need to make a significant effort to contact the operator of that asset, inform them that they have been infected and that you've been engaged with a customer to help, and offer to either help buy that VPN, buy that asset, take it over, or use some of our techniques with regard to deterrence, we call it. We really don't use the word retaliation, but I think that's the important distinction. And I don't know, Brian, if you want to share anything else on that topic.
As you're saying, a lot of our tactics, they fall into a gray area, and it actually depends on which country you are releasing information from, or which country you're accessing servers in. So there's a lot of things to consider as far as this question goes. It really depends on your country and the attacker's country and the compromised server's country.
Yeah, it's an important point. I mean, you just have to be cognizant of what you're doing, without a doubt. You do not want to get yourself into trouble. And we do this, obviously, professionally and for a living, so it helps, obviously, cross the T's and dot the I's.
Yep.
We're having a question here about how is Cylance going. Do you have any, do you have your own software? And yes, we actually do. We have announced and released a major part of our technology called our Infinity platform, and it's effectively applying mathematics to determining good from bad in files and file objects and executable objects, so that most of these attacks can be prevented without ever having a signature or an update or a behavioral analysis or heuristic analysis or anything. It is using pure math and science and algorithms to determine good from bad, and we are also going to be announcing an upcoming product in the early year, so please keep an eye out for that. We have questions about resellers and the channel partners. You certainly send those kind of emails in to us, and I'll definitely send them off to the right folks and internally inside Cylance. Let's see. So yeah, question is how, what's the main difference between our technology and some of the mainstream, antivirus vendors or even security? Let me take 2 seconds on this topic, and I'm not, I won't take over the rest of the time here with it, but it is an important point. So our entire industry, in my opinion, and you guys can argue with me plenty, I'm happy to hear every argument, but we have all been brainwashed to think that the only way to detect the attacker is by knowing the attack first. We have to know how they got in. We have to know how they bypassed a particular control or a defense, or we have to know what vulnerability they exploited, right? Or what feature they exploited. We have to know all this stuff, and unfortunately, that's the foundational problem of the entire industry, in my opinion. So now we've had to do that because we've no other way. Like, we've just been responsive. We've been reactive to all the attacks out there, and it has been a manual process because it is very time intensive to understand, well, what had really happened here. Well, imagine a world where you don't have that anymore. Imagine a world where machines learn for you. Just as a human would learn what an attack is, machines learn. Not by behavioral analysis, not by heuristic analysis, none of this stuff. It's simply by looking at it from the eye of a security expert and professional. So my famous story I tell about this is I was doing a talk up in Rochester, up at RIT, And we had just gotten acquired at Foundstone over at Maxi, and someone in the audience asked, point blank, Stuart, I want to know what products do you run on your computer right now? Okay, you're part of Maxi, Foundstone, whatever. You must be a big target. How do you protect your systems? And I often tell, I would say it to anybody asked, I don't use any products. Why? Because I know what not to allow to execute. I know what not to open. I know what not to click on. I know from my years of experience in creating an experiential database exactly what I should and should not do on a computer system. Now, I'm not 99.9% of the world. You guys are not 99.9% of the world. But the rest of the world need help in determining what's good and bad, right? That's why they've traditionally gone into solutions like this. But if you step back and you say, okay, well, why? How can you do this? It's because of that experiential database. And if you effectively create mathematical algorithms to represent the way of thinking of a security professional around best behavior, best practice in terms of that, and you make it an automated, miniaturized version onto the endpoint, you've solved the problem. You've attacked the source and the core of the problem, so that it doesn't matter what vector of attack comes in, USB, Bluetooth, web, email. It doesn't matter how the attack is going to get into the asset. You can detect it and block it. So sorry it took longer than I probably should have, but I wanted to make sure I was clear on that, because that is a good question. All right, so I know we're running up on the hour. I really appreciate everybody's attention, and if you are looking for any more resources, please go to our HE Twitter as well as our YouTube channel, and of course you can go to cylance.com. Actually, Brian has a Twitter account as well. You probably want to follow him. Smart, good guy to do that with. Other than that, thank you again, everybody, for your participation, and look for the recording in a couple of days. Have a great holidays. Take care, everyone.